kickoff event as we celebrate Temple Bethel's centennial year. I'm Dan Glowinski, and I'm the president of Temple Bethel. And it's nice to see all of you here, well rested after an extra hour's sleep, and ready to learn and participate. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to thank the people who have made this event possible, and also to give you a very brief history as to how this program came about. So let me start by thanking our organizing committee. I know you're out there somewhere, but Rachel Kest, Emily Crone, Wendy Strauss, Jesse Atkin, Debbie Zager, and of course our Rabbi Artson. I attended most of the planning sessions for this event, and I really am in awe of the creativity and dedication of this group, and we really had a lot of fun doing it as well. I want to especially thank Louis Norrie and the Norrie Family Advice Fund of the Foundation of the Jewish Federation for their generous support of this entire weekend. In addition to providing financial support for this weekend, Louis spent many hours helping us envision and plan this weekend, and for that we are particularly grateful. And finally, let me thank the Jewish Federation of Rochester and Jewish Family Service for being our partners in today's program. A little over 2 years ago, several of us from Temple Bethel attended the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism Centennial Conference. Even though my wife and I had had a long day of travel and had attended Friday night services and Friday night dinner, we decided to attend a 10 o'clock p.m. learning session entitled Life Lessons from My Son with Autism, given by Rabbi Artson. By the end of the hour, there was not a dry eye in the room. For me, the reasons were twofold. The first was Rabbi Artson's very personal and intimate discussion of the struggles and triumphs of raising a child with autism. The second, however, was listening to Rabbi Artson's journey of trying to find a synagogue that met the needs of his family. He forced those of us in attendance to take a critical look at our own synagogues, and many of us were not happy with what we saw. We knew that we could do better, and we understood that we had to do better. Shortly after that meeting, a group of parents with children who have disabilities formed an inclusion committee at Temple Bethel and dedicated themselves to creating a culture of inclusivity. This past year, Temple Bethel was one of 15 synagogues chosen to participate in the Rudiment Inclusion Action Community, which has resulted in the creation of a strategic plan to improve our accessibility and inclusivity for people with disabilities. And then came the next lesson. At last year's High Holidays, I spoke about the work of our inclusion committee. And in response, I received multiple phone calls and emails that meant something like this. I heard you talk about inclusion. I'm a gay member of this congregation. What about me? I'm an interfaith member of this congregation. What about me? This is when it became clear that what we really needed to discuss was, as Rabbi Artson has put it, radical inclusion. That is, how do we create a culture and an environment where every single person feels included? We cannot think of a more qualified person to lead that discussion than Rabbi Artson. Rabbi Artson is the dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, which has grown under his leadership from approximately 45 students to 80 students from around the world. He's also the vice president of the American Jewish University, where he teaches courses ranging from ancient and medieval Jewish philosophy to contemporary Jewish theology. Rabbi Artson received his doctorate in philosophy from the Hebrew Union College Institute of Religion, focusing on the integration of science and religion in process theology. He is the author of 7 books and over 108 published articles. Please welcome Rabbi Artson.
Good morning, and thank you, all of you, for being here. This is a talk that's going to begin in a couple different versions. because inclusion requires that. It never boils down to a broad, overarching theory. It's always real human beings, one at a time. And are they welcome as the real individuals that they are, with their unique complexity, with their unique history, with their distinctive story? There is no such thing as just human. There's always each particular one of us in the richness of all that we are. And we either make room for that staggering rainbow of difference, and by make room I mean relish it, or we are practicing a form of exclusion. So, beginning number one. My son Jacob, who is now 23, was labeled when he was 3 years old as severely autistic. He's not the kind of autistic that most Jewish organizations make room for. Jewish organizations like to say that they're starting with low-hanging fruit, by which they don't mean an LGBT diversity type. And turning people into forms of agriculture is itself a way of dismissing people. Of course, organizations that start with working with the low-hanging fruit never get to the upper branches. It just never happens. Okay, so Jacob is now 23, and last summer I showed him the film Milk, about San Francisco supervisor Harvey Milk, remarkable man and pioneer, first homosexual gay elected to a major public position, and who was a brilliant advocate for gay inclusion. And the movie starts in 1959 with a police raid on a gay bar. And my children are watching with me, and my daughter Shira, when the police arrest the guys, says, "What are they doing?" And I say, "Well, they're raiding the gay bar." And she said, "I can see that, but why are they being arrested?" And I realized, to a young person in 2015, this makes no sense. There has to be some other explanation, because it just can't be. But it was. Within my lifetime, I was born that year. At the end of the Milk movie, my son Jacob moves his hand over the buddy board. He uses facilitated communication to speak, so it's a form of assisted typing. And he types, "Abba, Milk's story is my story." And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "So he's not just a gay rights advocate, he's a human rights advocate." And I said, "Yes, he is." Showed him the movie about Martin Luther King. At the end of the Martin Luther King movie, he said, "Abba, this is my story." Yes, it is. He's not just an advocate for civil rights and African American dignity. He is a human rights warrior. At the end of the movie Chavez, my son, who keeps saying the same thing, because it is striking, it's the same damn story, again and again and again. How is it possible that we have to learn the same lesson again and again and again? When I was in rabbinical school, I was among the more liberal students in the conservative rabbinical school. My sister chose the week that I was going to move to New York to tell my mother that she was gay. And my mother was devastated. Devastated. My mother, who marched for Eugene McCarthy, my mother, who's a secular lefty, devastated. So when I was in New York, I met this extraordinary woman, Joni Friedman, who is a Reform rabbi, at the time a PhD candidate at Columbia University, and a lesbian. And my mother venerates scholarship. So I called her to tell her that, my sister could have a wonderful life ahead of her, that her orientation doesn't preclude having a meaningful life. And I said, there's this wonderful person that I met, Joni Friedman, and she's a lesbian and a rabbi. And my mother said, oh my God, her poor mother, 2 in 1. My mother is a Freudian analyst. She has no memory of that conversation. I'm sure that doesn't mean anything. Here's the question we all face, each and every one of us. We come loaded with a million invisible assumptions. And they're not always deliberate. In fact, I think for most of us, we want to be welcome. We want to be embracing. We want to think of ourselves as open-minded and inclusive. And we don't notice that we're not until, without our seeing it, somebody does something on the other side of our invisible assumptions. And then we respond out of habit. We go on to autopilot. Sometimes it's worse than that, but I think in this room, mostly that's what it is. We don't mean to exclude, but the kind of invisible, so-called benign assumptions that we make end up shutting people out of the room as effectively as if we kicked them out. So I want to talk about that in a minute, but I want to do it by way of talking about my son, if I could. So I'm using the example of a young man who struggles with autism, but I'm sure you will all recognize yourselves and your loved ones and countless numbers of different people who could tell versions of the same story, because as my Jacob points out, it's all the same story. When Jacob was 2.5, we noticed him starting to withdraw. I had been given great advice by a congregant that I should keep a diary of my kids' lives when they were infants, so that I would remember it later on, because she said, you won't remember anything. Which, I just have to tell you, I thought was ridiculous at the time, but it's completely true. Who can remember? Because you're stone tired the entire time, you're harassed by your offspring, right? You're overwhelmed by the amount of tasks to do. You're like biologically set up. It's a blank slate. The year ends, the fog lifts, and you say, what are these 2 things in my house? So, I kept a diary until I noticed that I was only writing entries about Shira. And then I stopped, because I didn't want to have a record of having nothing to say about myself. At some point, a really wonderful congregant who taught special needs kids in the public school came up to me and said, Rabbi Artson, I don't mean to offend, I don't mean to upset you, but I've noticed some things about Jacob's behavior that might be worth bringing him in to have him assessed. So P.S. People apologize for the wrong things. I don't for the life of me understand why people offering loving suggestions, whether they're helpful or not, but loving suggestions, well-intended, why one would apologize for that or hesitate about that. Right? The problem, the people who should apologize, are the people who say cruel and hurtful things, or who say excluding things. Those people are the ones who should apologize. They never do. I guess that means that if you feel the need to apologize, you're probably okay. Unless you're not, in which case you should apologize. So, we took Jacob in to be tested, and the pediatrician ran a battery of tests which were grossly unsuccessful. Jacob didn't cooperate with any of them. And at the end of it, he came out and he said that your son has pervasive developmental disorder, PDD, which is a scientific term that tells you exactly what you knew when you brought your kid in the first place. Pervasive means there's more than one manifestation. It's a developmental disorder. That means your kid isn't developing like the other kids. I know there's more than one way my kid's not developing like the other kids. That's why I brought him here in the first place. But after telling us he has PDD, he then starts to discuss what you do in the treatment of autism. And after 15 minutes, I said, Doctor, if Jacob has PDD, why are you talking about autism? And here I want to say, I hope this has changed in the medical profession, he didn't give us the honest answer, because he didn't want to hurt our feelings. So he said this mealy-mouthed, I don't even remember what, about PDD, and as a result, we lost half a year of treatment. Because if he just said, your kid's autistic, we'd have done something about it. But he said, PDD. So we scrounged around for what do you do with PDD? Eventually it became clear that Jacob wasn't just PDD, he was struggling with autism. It was a fairly severe version of autism. We got him into various treatments. The world of autism at the time, and this was 20 years ago, was brand new. It wasn't that long before that the regnant theory, the dominant theory about autism, was that it was caused by emotionally unavailable mothers. Can you imagine, right? Having a child with special needs and then all the professionals tell you it's your fault? Really? There's a special place in hell for the experts. So, we tried all kinds of wacky treatments. We tried all kinds of terrible treatments. I won't bore you with the treatments that are still very popular that I think are horrible. We settled on floor time. Floor time is a kind of treatment in which you enter into the world of a child and you create closed circles of communication. You get them to communicate in some way. I want to play with the train. Do you want to play with the caboose, or do you want to play with the front of the train? And you make them respond to you at their level with their concerns in increasing numbers of circles of communication. I'm a big advocate of floor time. So is Barry Krzan, whose book is available out there. So is Elaine Hall, whose book is out there. You have a lot of floor time people on the table in the book section. Floor time was miraculous for Jacob. Eventually, we moved to Los Angeles. Here you're going to start to hear the anger part of my story. I apologize for that. I don't think there's anyone who has struggled with issues of diversity who's not pissed off. Sorry. Although I will say he has some anger management issues too. So. We went for our first assessment with the public school system. You know, you get the principal and the school psychologist and the teacher and everyone together for, what is it, the IEP, we get it for the IEP. My wife is a federal prosecutor, which is handy to have in the family, by the way. That's the useful thing. So she had read the entire statute book on disability law, which she had like yellow stickies in, and she had highlighted, and she just put it on the center of the table. She never touched it or referred it. She just left it there as a kind of token. That meeting went horribly. Right? Horribly because people who you assume went into education because they wanted to help kids get educated had over the years had their souls sucked out of them by the system. So that all they were doing was protecting their budget. And that's a good way to make a mom who's a federal prosecutor mad. I know from personal experience you do not want Ilana to be mad. So the best news I heard after our third meeting with them, the third IEP, I had a congregant who was a teacher, and she was at an IEP for another family that we didn't know had nothing to do with us, and the school psychologist did not come to the meeting, which you know is, I mean, at that point you basically take the keys to the building and you hand them to the parents, they now own the school. The school principal turned to my congregant unknowingly and said, well, thank God that wasn't the Artsons. which made me about as happy as anything anyone has ever said to me. Right? If I can get those bureaucrats to think that we are their worst nightmare, then I have lived a meaningful life. We moved to Los Angeles in part because it would provide far more extensive services for Jacob. We joined a wonderful synagogue. I'm not going to name the synagogue for reasons that will be obvious as I start to trash it. There were two kinds of people at the synagogue. The nice people who said hello to Jacob and then ignored him for the next 3 hours. And most of the people who just skipped step 1 and went immediately to step 2. Jacob would sit in the lobby alone for 4 hours. And nobody would say a word to him. It got to when Jacob, I have to say, my son is the kid who loves Judaism. Jacob, every autistic kid has something that they focus on with great intensity. Jacob's object of fixation is Torah. If he and I are hiking in the woods, he will break 2 twigs, lay them down parallel, take a 3rd twig and go, Amen, and start chanting. Jacob knows the entire synagogue liturgy by heart. He can sing any service he wants at any moment without a book. He knows incredible Torah. He wrote a prayer book for his bar mitzvah, in which he wrote the commentary. If you're interested, email me, I'll send it to you. Right? Yeah, prayer book. He grew to hate synagogue, which meant soon thereafter, my wife grew to hate synagogue. In addition to that, there are people whom I call defenders of the faith. Defender of the faith is someone who is zealous in enforcing every rule within Judaism, except for the rule that every person is made in God's image. So, I'll tell you the worst moment of that. I'm in Jerusalem, meeting with my students as I do. The 3rd year of rabbinical school is in Jerusalem, so I'm meeting with them. I get a phone call from Ilana. It's still Shabbos in Los Angeles. She's so mad there's smoke coming out of the phone. All right? She took Jacob to the synagogue. She was given an aliyah to the Torah, which we call them to the Torah. And she brought Jacob with him. And so he could practice having an aliyah, because he needs to be able to, the only way he learns is by doing it. It went fine. Jacob was great. He behaved fine. Immediately upon sitting down, the chair of the ritual committee came over to Ilana and said, "You can never do that again. It's the policy of the synagogue that children before bar mitzvah age are not allowed to have an aliyah." So she called me crazy. I, from Jerusalem, called the synagogue rabbi. And I tell him I have a question, and then I'm going to have something he needs to do. The question is it indeed the policy of the congregation that Jacob can't accompany his parent in having an aliyah? And he said, no, certainly Jacob could do that. I said, good. I had one more question. Could any special needs child have an aliyah if it helps them prepare to have an aliyah? And he said, absolutely. I said, okay, then I need you to do 2 things for me. I need you to phone the ritual chair and tell him that he had misunderstood the policy of the synagogue and that he should never do that again. And then I need a letter from you that says that I can put in my tallis bag, and I'm going to carry it with me to the synagogue every Shabbat until his bar mitzvah, so that the next defender of the faith will back off. And he said, well, you're a rabbi, why don't you tell him? And I said, no, I am an aggrieved father right now. You're the rabbi of the synagogue, this is your job. Okay, but I want you to think, what is it like that every Shabbat morning when I open my tallis bag, prayer shawl. I open my tallis bag to take out my tallis, and there I have to see the letter that more or less says, your son isn't garbage. I called the religious school and asked if Jacob could participate in the religious school. My daughter desperately wanted not to participate in the religious school. For her, they have room. But the religious school, which Jacob desperately wanted to be part of, said what most Jewish institutions say, which is, Rabbi Artson, we'd love to include your son, we just don't have the resources. Can I translate that to you into plain English? What that means in English is your son is not going to provide a return on the investment. That is to say, we think of your son as a form of charity at best, garbage at worst. I was told that by the summer camp that I supervise. Right? No, your son cannot come with an aide unless he's capable of coming without an aide. He can't attend. So my son, who desperately wanted to go to Jewish summer camp, couldn't. Okay, that's most of the angry part. Oh, sorry, one other piece of angry to get off my chest. Thank you. Very therapeutic. I mentioned to you that Jacob loves the Torah. That means that whenever the Torah is around, he's squealing and jumping. Because it's incredibly exciting. You have the most important book in the history of the world right in front of you. Who wouldn't want to jump and squeal? Right? So every time the Torah would come out, he would leap out of his chair and he would start dancing around the room. Which I just want to remind you is how we should feel when they take the Torah out of the ark too. Right? So every time he would do that, some other defender of the faith would turn around, glare at me, and say, can't you control your son? This happened at airports where Jacob would have meltdowns, where people would walk by, hundreds of people would walk by, and nobody would say, can I help you? Do you need anything? Most people would pretend we weren't visible to the eye, and they would act as though they didn't see or hear anything, which was impossible because he's lying in the middle of the aisle screaming at the top of his lungs. And those who spoke to us would say things like, get him out of here, or control him, or you need to move, as if I didn't know any of those things. Okay. Fast forward. The Federation in Los Angeles holds an inclusion conference kind of like this. They invite all of the synagogues of Los Angeles to bring a team of people, the rabbi, the executive director, the ritual director, the education director, some lay leadership. Come to this conference, we're going to talk about inclusion. And they have a panel of experts talking. I'm the keynote speaker. My son is present too. And at the end of my talk, I say, I need to tell you, you would never have a conference on women's role in the synagogue in which all the panelists were men. That would be part of the problem. So you can't have a conference on special needs inclusion in which you don't have someone with special needs giving a talk. You can't do that ever again. And I volunteer my son, Jacob, will come to the synagogue, by the way, he will come here. Jacob will give a presentation. You need to hear from people who are self-advocates, right? They have to speak on their own behalf. Of the 50 synagogues in Los Angeles, do you know how many followed up with an invitation to Jacob? One. That synagogue was a new upstart community called Ikar. The Rabbi of Ikar is a saint called Sharon Browse. She's amazing. The music is amazing. So Jacob was their first scholarly residence. And as he was walking out, he turned to my wife, Ilana. I was doing a gig like I am now. And he typed to her, this place is incredible. Why aren't we members here? And Ilana said to him, well, I need to talk to your father, but we're going to be. So let me tell you two car stories. One, it's Friday night, and we have services in Roxbury Park, which is a quaint little park in a town called Beverly Hills. And And so we do a picnic outside beforehand. It's a vegetarian picnic, of course, because our rabbi is a rabid vegetarian fanatic. So those of us who are still eating animals, we put up with the lack of flesh for the sake of the quality of the service and its spirituality. And those of you who have already elevated yourselves to a higher spiritual level, you'd be right at home. So we have our vegetarian meal, and then we go into the social hall of the park for our service, and it's really packed. I mean, it's incredibly packed. There's no extra room. And Jacob is working on staying in as long as he can. The music is pumping, and the energy is awesome. So when at some point he just runs out of juice, he's got to leave the room. And it happened to be that was the moment we started the silent prayer. So the room goes silent, Jacob leaps up, turns to me, and says loud enough that the whole then he covers his ears because he's really loud in there, and there's a door right next to us he could have slipped out of, but no, he doesn't do that. He starts wending his way through the packed room to go out the door on the other end of the room. The whole time shouting, "I'll be right back, I'll be right back, I'll be right back," over and over and over, and I am dying. Right? Because at normal synagogues, that's the point where people turn and scowl at you. That's the point where someone defends Judaism by saying you should take your kid out, right? Or tells you what a bad parent you're being. So I'm bracing myself. I've got a knot in my stomach. I'm getting ready to not say the wrong thing when whoever comes to defend Judaism. And sure enough, predictably, within a minute, there's a tap on my shoulder, and I turn to this defender of the faith, and she says, "Rabbi Artson, looking at the way your son loves Judaism reminds us why we're here." I started to cry. I turned to Alana and I said, "We're home." These people don't see Jacob as pathology. They see him as Jacob. A couple weeks later, the music is so awesome that Jacob can't stay in his seat anymore. So he folds out of the seat and he comes right up in front of the rabbi and the cantor, and he starts dancing full-blown Hasidic dance. Right? He's channeling some Hasidic master from the 1700s. The minute the service was over, the rabbi and the cantor independently make a beeline to me and Alana to say, if we only created a car for his dancing at that moment, that would have been enough of a reason. That was the most spiritual thing I've ever seen. That's what inclusion is. Inclusion is you are not a pathology. And your nature doesn't make you defective. It makes you distinct. It makes you unusual. It makes you interesting and wonderful. Don't you think it's exhausting to live in a world in which we all have to fake being the same? I don't have the energy to do that anymore. I don't. Because each of us are unique. That's what Judaism says, that every human being is made b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. That the Midrash Jewish legend teaches that God makes no two people identical in order to teach us that every person is of infinite worth. Going to try it. I'm good. You're fine. So there's an organization in New York that's an LGBT advocacy group, and they did an evaluation of congregations, and they handed out grades to synagogues, how well they're doing on LGBT inclusion. I have to tell you, they're not popular at ICAR these days. They gave ICAR a B- for LGBT inclusion. Despite the fact that one of our two rabbis is an out lesbian, despite the fact that we have been doing gay commitment ceremonies and weddings from our inception, despite the fact that I think easily a fourth of our membership are gay, despite the fact that our Minyan Senate program, our justice program, is involved with local LGBTQ issues. We got a B- because we don't have an LGBT inclusion committee. Which leads me to my big point. One, it's not inclusion if someone's excluded. I want you to say that with me because we all need to practice saying that because there will be times in your life where you're going to need to say that to someone. It's not inclusion if someone's excluded. You can do better than that. It's not inclusion if someone's excluded. Okay, that means you don't get to say we're starting with this subset of people and then call the program inclusion. You can call it more inclusive than we used to be. That's fine. You can say we're on the way to inclusion. That's also fine. But you don't get to call it inclusion unless no one's excluded. Come on, guys. I'm going to do this until you get it. You don't get to call it inclusion until no one's excluded. Excellent. That's very good. And when I say no one is excluded, I don't mean the people you like. And I don't mean the groups you've already become comfortable with. I mean radical inclusion we take from the prophet Isaiah. My house shall be a house of prayer for all people. He doesn't say some people. He doesn't say Jewish people. He doesn't say straight or gay or bi or trans people. He says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all people. And Isaiah is not speaking for himself. He's channeling the big one. Right? That's God's word on the subject. A house for all people. Okay, so it's not inclusion if someone's excluded. Two, because I know there are a lot of professionals who just got a stomachache there. It's a partnership. Meaning inclusion doesn't mean you have to do whatever the person in front of you tells you you have to do. You have to have a conversation. So we spent years taking Jacob to the movie theater, for example, and learning not to kick the chair in front of him. And if he couldn't stop kicking the chair, we took him out of the theater. Inclusion doesn't mean you have to put up with having your chair kicked. But you have to be willing to let someone learn. You have to be willing to not see them as worthless because they're learning how to socialize properly. Jacob can now go to movies with the best of them. He can fly on a 5-hour flight with the best of them. That didn't used to be true. So we need to make room for others to learn and for ourselves to learn. One of my watchwords is just because you're the parent of a special needs child doesn't mean you're not a jerk. That's true for any labeled group. Just because you are a fill-in-the-blank doesn't mean you're not behaving inappropriately here. But it means we have a conversation. Tell me what you need. Here's my concerns about that. Let's talk about how we can reach a partnership so that everybody gets what they need. Can we do that? Can we make that happen? Third thing I want to say is this is not about pity, and this is not about charity. My son doesn't want your pity, and I don't either. I love my family. I'm lucked out with the son that I have. I don't want your son. And if you want to tell me about how your kid went to Princeton and made it into a prestigious law firm and is living in Manhattan independent, that's great. And if that makes you and your son happy, I'm good. Because my son is living a great life. And that's all I want for my kids. But that was an education for me, because I did have an Ivy League education. So I used to say all I want is for my kids to be happy, but you don't actually mean that when you say that. No Jew actually means that when they say that. Right? And the only reason you think you mean it is because your kids haven't shown you that they don't buy your definition of happiness. And the minute they tell you that, everything comes crashing down. So we all have to re-educate ourselves, all of us, about what it is that makes people happy, which it turns out is no single thing. Lots of different things make people happy. A year ago, I discovered a term that some of you may be very familiar with. Someone told me that I'm a cis. Right? I have a definition for those of you who don't know what cis is. Cis is your sexual category if you don't know what cis is. Nobody who's cis knows what that is. Right? But people who aren't cis will be happy to educate you what it is, and I believe there's a glossary out in the lobby where you can look it up. I'm not going to be the one to tell you that. But I am, I suppose. So one of the things that has changed is when I went to college back in the Neolithic period, the big cutting-edge gender issue was, does she pay for the second date? I have an opinion on that subject. I even got a policy on that subject in college. I was cutting edge in 1977. But I can't assume that what was cutting edge in 77 is even reasonable now. And that means I need to stay open to learning from everyone. I need to make everyone my teacher. That doesn't mean you have to agree with whatever anyone says. They can be unreasonable too. But it does mean before you write off their opinion, and what you mean by writing it off is, I've never thought this thought before, so it must be wrong. That's a bad way to move through the world, just giving you a little hint. If you take a look at the last 2,000 years, pretty much every good idea that is now a basic assumption, somebody important and credentialed dismissed as wrong once. Right? So being open to people who don't have titles and don't have pedigrees and don't have credentials, telling you this is my reality. Being open to that is a really good way to stay current. And we all have an obligation to stay current. Last thing I want to say, and then I want to open it up to whatever comments you want to make. I mentioned that this is not about charity, and it's not about charity. None of us will make it out of here alive. I mean, this planet. None of us. And there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who know that they have a special need, and there are people who don't yet know or don't yet have a special need. But you will someday, if you're lucky. And that means that this is your time to fashion a world that will welcome your distinctiveness prior to your having it. Because I can tell you from personal experience, the minute you are laying on the hospital bed, nobody listens to you anymore. Right? The minute you have the special need, you're just whining. So this is your time to make a world in which everybody is welcome, because you're going to need it. This is about self-interest. It's also self-interest because we live in a world in which there are powerful industries that maintain power and money by telling you what's wrong with you. You're too fat, you're too thin, you're too male, you're too female, you're too trans, your hair's the wrong color, or the wrong shape, or you don't have enough of it, or you have too much of it. Do you know that there are people with thin hair? As a 56-year-old man, I find that inconceivable. Because the good Lord is my hairdresser in that department, thank you very much, and it's thinning quite nicely, don't you think? There are entire industries designed to make you think you're ugly, to make you think you're unworthy, to make you think you are broken, or blemished, or disgraceful. And I want to tell you with all the force of Rabbinic Judaism, with all of the energy of the Torah, that it is a toxic lie. You are a child of God, and you are magnificent. And you were created exactly as you are because no one like you has ever existed. This is not only theology, this, by the way, is now biology. No two human brains are identical because each brain, from the moment it is conceived, is tweaking its neurons in a distinctive way to incorporate its own unique experiences. That means never in the history of humanity has a brain exactly like yours ever existed, nor will it ever again. You are unique. And when I say you are made exactly the way God wants, I do not mean that doesn't mean you have stuff to work on. You do. But the only way you can muster the courage to work on it is to know that you are beautiful as you are, inside and out, to know that you are cherished and honored and loved as you are, and that's what gives you the courage to be able to face the places where you could be better. Don't you want to live in that world? Don't you want to live in a come-as-you-are world in which you are welcome? You are seen as a benefit. You are seen as a blessing. At some point, you're going to need to wear a hearing aid. And it's going to be loudly in the library, on the plane, in the services. And people will look at you. Wouldn't you like them to smile instead of glare? Someday you're going to find a partner to share your life who may not be everything on the list. Wouldn't you like people to respond with excitement and joy and see in that person the wonder that you see? Someday you will love people, children, teenagers, adults of different ages, who won't communicate the way you do, who won't process the way you do, who won't move the way you do. And if you render them invisible, you make them miserable and your soul shrinks. Because, says the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic thought, every person we encounter is a shaliach, a messenger. And they are a messenger of the Most High. And they bring to us a message that only they can bring and that we desperately need at that moment. But if you turn away the messenger without opening the message, you don't get the message. You don't get the message. So I want us to see this as a call to action. This is not politics in a partisan way. This is an invitation to create the world that God offers us. The vision of God is that the lion will lie with the lamb, and neither shall be afraid. Right? You know, Woody Allen's great response to that, the lion may lie with the lamb, but the lamb won't get any sleep. There are too many lions out in the world waiting to shred the sheep. And we are all of us sheep in someone's eyes. But if we band together, I have seen antelope chase lions away when they refuse to be set into separate categories. Not my problem, I'm a buck, I'm not a doe. Not my problem, the lion's over there and not over here. No. When the antelopes say, okay, no lion is touching any of us without it being my issue, then the lions back off. So I want to invite us to stand arm in arm together. I want us to create a holy cadre of soldiers in God's army of radical inclusion. Nobody excluded, nobody marginalized, everybody welcomed, no exceptions. Thank you.